May the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart be always acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. So I've only been gone for 2 weeks, but I feel like I've been gone forever. And we have these intense readings from this incredible passage from Proverbs about people not hearing the cries of wisdom in the street. In the squares she raises her voice. This incredible passage from the Wisdom of Solomon. We had a wonderful discussion on the Wednesday reflection group about this reading from James, the power of the tongue. Like the rudder of a great ship or the bridle in a horse, our tongues can somehow move our entire bodies and change our lives and our destinies and affect our relationships and everything around us. This small little organ can create such a fuss. And then finally, this incredibly powerful passage in Mark. Those who want, if anyone to become my followers, let them deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow me. And I feel like in another Sunday or another time of the year, this would be like a softball across the plate for me. I'd be like, excellent, 3 big, heavy readings. I'm going to wade in with these and, I don't know, say something important. But I'm very mindful of the things that have been happening in our country, and we're in the nation's capital, and there's an election campaign going on, and suddenly we've been talking about refugees for the last couple of years, off and on with great passion, I think in this parish for quite some time, and suddenly now the refugee crisis, really when I was in New Orleans, I read an article in the Globe and Mail on my phone, I'm like, whoa, the whole dialogue of the country seemed to have shifted while we were away. And I'm still sort of trying to get a lay of the land. And I'm also a priest, I have to say, just establishing tons of context for this sermon for some reason. I'm also a priest where I did all of my formation in the United States. And in the U.S., church and politics are like this sometimes. Both on the right wing and left wing, right? If you think about Martin Luther King Jr., if you buy a double CD pack of his works, one CD is all of his great sermons, and the other CD are all of his political speeches that he gave on Washington, that he gave to sanitation workers. He was just as much of a political voice as he was a religious voice, right? So we have him sort of as a classic left wing, and of course we've heard lots of stuff on the right wing over the last few years as well. And so as a result, being an Anglican and being who I am, I'm deeply reluctant to preach a political sermon of any kind. and yet it seems that is what I'm called to sort of do. So I'm going to go around it. Because I think it's so complicated. And I think that there's so much heartbreak sometimes around politics, because I think for one group of people, there's a message and there's a belief and there's a sense of where the country should be going. And I think sometimes it can be in our very heart and our very core of who we are. Our identity can sometimes be fused with what is happening, right? And it makes sense because politicians, we're electing them to speak on our behalf. That's what they do, really. They speak on our behalf in Parliament, and they speak on our behalf in the world stage, and it can be a deeply alarming thing to have somebody speaking on your behalf that isn't speaking what you believe. So I feel everything is, sometimes it can be very high stakes, and we can get very, very passionate, especially if it's an issue like refugees, and you contrast the passion that we have for our commitment to reaching out for people throughout the world, and then others' deep compassion for our own safety. And it can get very intense. I have a friend of mine who can be very, to be honest, openly militant at times. And he'll say to me, I sympathize with you, Geoff. You're a very compassionate guy, but freedom isn't free. He says to me. And I'm like, that's the problem. Because if from my perspective, I would say absolutely. Freedom isn't free. We live in a democracy, and in a democracy, you have to sacrifice some of your own freedom and well-being for the sake of the greater good. Right? Absolutely, freedom isn't free. Jesus himself is saying, if you want to be my follower, you have to deny yourself, take up your cross, and follow me. You have to give up your freedom if you want to be a Christian, which sometimes means making great sacrifices and even sacrificing your own life for the sake of the gospel. Absolutely, freedom isn't free. Sometimes we have to give up our freedom for the sake of people that we love, for our love for God, and even love for our own enemies. And he'd say, what are you talking about? Right? I mean something completely different. He meant to preserve our own safety as a nation. We have to sacrifice some of our liberties. We have to become more surveilled by the government and sacrifice some of our personal liberties and give some of our liberties to powerful forces like the police and the military to safeguard the safety of our country. Two very, very different interpretations of one simple phrase. And both of us would say that same phrase thinking it was obvious what we meant, and we meant two completely different things. I think politics can be enormously stressful and difficult to talk about because there's so much weight to so many of these words that we all seem to think are obvious when they can be interpreted in radically different ways. A comical example would be YOLO. You heard this one? You only live once. YOLO. It's used, but it's old now. It's like 2013. I think, right? Like Drake. Is that anyways? But I'm like, absolutely. You only live once, so don't risk your life. You know what I mean? You only live once, so what are you doing leaping out of an airplane with a parachute? Just relax. Have a coffee, right? But of course, you only live once. I got to experience the wonder of the world, and I got to try out all these things, and I got to take some risks because you only live once, right? So I find, and to be honest, our gospel, of course, we all are aware of the history of the church throughout the ages, and so many things that Jesus himself said have been interpreted in radically different ways. So I don't really know how to do a political sermon exactly. I'm much more comfortable preaching the gospel. So the only thing that I'm going to say as far as what one should do, the one sort of concern that I would have is the trap that we sometimes get in as citizens, I think, to not act in the voting booth how we would act in our lives. I think that's something that we can all sort of embrace. It seems simple, but it's not, right? It's very easy to be ourselves when we're alone or with people that we're very comfortable with our families, with our friends. It's very easy to be ourselves. But there's a lot of pressures that we feel to be truthful in our actions, truthful in our thoughts, truthful in what we say. For example, in our jobs, we have a job where we're constantly called to make sacrifices, perhaps moral sacrifices, to keep our careers. This is the advice that people give on the internet. Because a lot of people say, well, we need to police the internet. We don't really need to police the internet. We just need to act online the same way that we act in real life. Right? There's a lot of people that say some crazy mean things on the internet that they would never say in real life. The issue isn't cracking down on the internet so much as it's convincing people online to treat each other the same way that they would treat each other in real life. The same can be said in sports. Like I was saying to our young parishioners, the same can be said in our prayers. It's the strangest thing. I think a lot of us, whether we realize it or not, when we pray, we say something different to God than how we're actually feeling. And I think it can be deeply harmful to our prayer life to not be deeply honest to God about the things that we're wrestling with, our lamentations as well as our joys. And I think that's the only thing I think we can do in the voting booth. I just feel like no matter what campaign that we're following, there can be a certain degree of manipulation. And we might vote based on fear or based on some sense of identity. This person reminds me of me, even though I don't necessarily believe what they're saying or I don't share their belief system. So that's my one, if I'm going to say anything political, it would just be that if you're a Christian here and you're a faithful person here, then be the same person throughout your life, whether it's online, whether it's in your career, whether it's with your family, playing sports, in your prayers, or when you're voting. Be the same person. Be yourself. Be who God has called you to be. Amen.